All right. So I'm sorry that it's going to be a little bit of a rougher transition between this sort of harder arithmetical and harder scientific kind of perspective to the quote-unquote softer psycho-spiritual kind of perspective, and even more so in some ways the Jungian and similar kinds of perspectives. So I'll try to do as much bridging where possible. I don't know how good a job I'll do at that per se. But I'd love to begin my little part of this with a quote by one of my favorite ceremonial magicians, Lon Milo Duquette, who says, "Of course it's all in your head. You just don't know how big your head really is." And I think, if anything, that statement really sums up kind of my take on what we might call mysticism or mystical experience, which I see as attainable through altering consciousness, experiencing non-ordinary states of reality, as some might call it, or non-ordinary states of consciousness, as others might call it. I believe that this type of active dreaming, as Jung might call it, the use of active imagination that's attainable through changing consciousness states, is the way to kind of access mystical states. Of course, I'm making it sound a lot more like it's in our control and it's intentional and purposeful, not forgetting that William James, who is one of the founders of psychology as well as pragmatic philosophy, said of mysticism that one of the features is that it's a passive experience. In other words, it happens to us, as opposed to something that's being kind of in our control or something that we intend to kind of make happen. However, in my experience, I think that it really is possible to sort of maximize the probability, if you will, that you can enter into this sort of changed consciousness place where suddenly it becomes possible to imagine your life in a much broader, in some ways, much more useful way. When you are faced with a particular experience of reality, of the world, of your life, that kind of contradicts any sort of continuity with what has gone before in your life. So sometimes this happens accidentally to people. Maybe they're walking in the woods at a liminal kind of day, time of day, at sunset. Maybe they have taken a risk and tried a funny little mushroom along the way. And this puts and shifts their sort of consciousness into sort of a different place. And then suddenly everything sort of changes for them. Suddenly they feel a tangible connection to something greater than themselves. They experience a sense of all-encompassing love that feels more universal. They feel like they're a part of something that's much bigger than, their small little lives as they've lived it up to that point. And so perhaps this sort of accidental opening or awakening leads to things in their lives. Maybe it's a one-time experience. Maybe it leads them to pursue things that will open up the probability that that sort of experience might happen again. Others might deliberately pursue, intentionally, a path where they have this existential feeling of emptiness and yearning of, is this all there is? I've lived my life according to the rules. I've done what I can to earn a living for myself, for my family. I've lived by what I understand to be sort of the laws of science in my life and as it applies to me, and it just feels sort of empty. It just feels sort of meaningless. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm kind of going through the motions. There's this yearning for richness, depth, and color. And all sometimes they know is that there are certain things that might evoke a feeling that some might call homesickness, or a feeling of once being a part of something that's been lost irretrievably. Of course, a lot of this gets at what James has also called the ineffable, right? Which is that which can't be put into words. And I have to laugh, it's always a psychologist who's going to try to put into words something that can't be put into words. And that the word ineffable is such a paradox itself, right? Ineffable means something that can't be described, but we're going to try to describe it anyway. Still, I think that we have to have kind of a frame of reference, and some people become adept, if you will, at altering consciousness. To me, honestly, in my experience, I'm making claims for no one else. Probably one of the easiest, if you will, straightforward ways to kind of experience a mystical sort of place in your life, or to kind of engage with that, to foster it, to maximize the probability that it'll happen on a more regular basis, is to take a look at dreams. And this is where I see people like Robert Moss and Carl Jung really kind of moving to the similar kind of place. In dreams, we are able, if we have some discipline, to write them down, to get better at remembering them, to make it an active practice in our life, to really understand how they are opening up imagination with a capital I. And not just imagination in the definition of sort of a little small ego flight of fancy, the little sort of daydreaming of sort of a passive nature. We're talking Jungian active imagination, which is that deepest part of our psyche in which we engage the very creative source within us that mysteriously seems to connect up with what's going on in the universe itself. As Duquette says, it's all in your head, but the nature of your head may indeed be much bigger. So if we can actively understand our dreams, the symbols, if you will, the archetypes, Jung talks about archetypes, universal symbols found in art and mythology that seem to recur again and again, that seem to line up with what David referred to as the synchronicity of things. The symbols that help us with this pattern recognition, ultimately. If we stop seeing it as just kind of a random, meaningless, accidental activity, entertain for ourselves the possibility that it does open up a meaningful connection to something, pragmatically, it leads us to some damned interesting places and some really creative avenues of self-awareness. You sort of need to be okay with the art of all of this that is sort of the other side of the coin for the science piece of it. And no matter how unartistic we think we are, all of us have some imaginative capacity, and all of us have the capability of deepening that imaginative capacity. Dream work is an easy sort of way to do that. If you start to really keep track of your dreams, follow the symbols that sort of emerge in your dreams, the imagery that emerges, seeing how they coincidentally, in that pattern recognition sort of way, line up with real life kinds of things. Allow yourself some time to really contemplate that. I think you're going to find spontaneous plunges into what we call mysticism happening on a fairly regular basis. I think we miss opportunities, honestly, all the time because we're not connected to this active imagination with a capital I. And trying to find some way into that can really make the difference in a huge way. I'm fascinated by Carl Jung and his life because Jung, of course, applied this to himself. When he was really deeply pissed off and sort of traumatized and grieving the loss of his relationship with Sigmund Freud, very profound mentoring relationship, he retreated into his tower by the lake, in almost a fairy tale kind of way, became the wizard hermit, didn't really talk to many people for a long time except his family mostly and some friends who would come in. And he would write in his thing that he called the Red Book, which the title was supposed to be the Liber Novus, the new book, ultimately the collection of all of his sort of dreaming, imaginings, his flights and descents, if you will, into the depths and the heights of his own soul, as he described it, his own psyche, where the mythical connections lined up with the personal in his life, and he started to experience pieces of his dreaming as having independent existence from himself in a truly psychotic, quote, and delusional kind of way. And it's an interesting debate to this day whether he actually went a little crazy, because he certainly talked as if these entities that came to him were beings that were somehow separate from himself. And the way that he described it was, it's not really separate from myself, but they have independent existence within my imagination. And they come and they can teach me things about me, things about the universe, things about my life. I mean, one of them was Salome, that Salome of biblical fame that cut off the head of John the Baptist. And Jung's ultimate big aha insight was she was there to help him cut off his head because he was entirely too much in love with his own intellectual brilliance. And in order to connect in a compassionate, heart-open, more universal way with his clients, his head needed to cease being a part of the picture. And when he got this and connected it up with conversations he'd had with indigenous elders, in terms of their reflections on what's wrong with the white race, being too much thinking with their heads and not enough thinking with their hearts and all of that, he sort of got it, and he sort of emerged from this state with this huge volume of work, the Red Book, that his family kept secret for a long time, pseudo-secret. I mean, it was an ill-kept secret, I guess, but very few people were allowed to see it. Until 2009, when they finally released it and published it, with the understanding that it would be reproduced in almost exactly the same form and size originally, that Jung himself kind of created it. And it revealed Jung to be a much bigger artist than everybody suspected. The art world took great interest in a lot of the colorful pictures that, all of the mandalas and the trees and the snakes and the mythological imagery that he did. He had a lot of technical expertise as an artist. So the Red Book is just this beautiful work that's a product of his dreaming for several years by the side of the lake, alone in his tower, becoming psychotic, having, a series of mystical experiences, and ultimately producing, work that takes up about this much room on my bookshelf of the collected works that we might call the black books, ultimately. Robert Moss kind of takes off on that and says that we can engage with symbols that match up with our dreams. If we get in touch with dreams that lead us to some really rich places, why not recreate those things through art or some sort of like concrete product of imagining? I think of, Angie and I, we have altars and art, and everywhere we look, it's like a gate into some other reality because of the symbols that remind us of certain kinds of things. There are art which connects us to earthly kinds of things, art which connects us to air kinds of things, art which connects us to water kinds of things, art which connects us to fire, spirit, but also deep dimensions of, our own experience, as well as, what you might call the sacred, the divine, having to do with deities, however we might kind of engage with those or understand it. But everything in our house is an intentional portal that opens us up, that momentarily presents an opportunity for shifting consciousness for a moment out of the mundane sort of day-to-day trap we all can find ourselves in, to open up and appreciate just a moment of beauty and dream for a little bit as we are standing there in waking reality, entering into this waking dream for just a moment. When you do this as a habit, you start to experience reality itself as we understand it to be a lot more fragile, and you kind of stay in a liminal place. Of course, the key is also to be grounded enough to kind of pay the bills and, make life work. I always say that if the shaman is one who walks between worlds, I say the shaman must also walk competently between worlds, and experience them fully. I think that all of these things can kind of help us do that by opening windows on beauty, ultimately, with a capital B. And, I could say a lot more about, where the philosophers were going with their whole connection with beauty. But enough to say that I think genuine mystical experiences open those windows on beauty. Active imagination, with a capital I, is one of the most ready ways to kind of engage that, and also to kind of live in a way that maximizes the probability that those windows will open very often, ultimately. So I could say a whole lot more, but I'm also conscious of the time. But a lot of thoughts, I think a lot of possibilities through dream work and how you can open up the imaginative capacity in a really rich way and kind of free ourselves from this feeling of drudgery of what am I doing this all for, what is it all about, and really connecting with something that's rich and extraordinary, and that you're actually doing something that's important, and that you're connected to kind of a meaningful place on a regular basis. So a little all over the place, but I'm trying to kind of capture a lot of the thoughts in the short time we had, so hopefully that pinged on something for you all.
Great. You're a good speaker.
Oh yes, questions, yes. Or comments.
Well, I was actually reminded of my favorite Ernest Hemingway quote: "Write drunk, edit sober." And you know, I mean, I don't take that literally, but I think the broader meaning is that any kind of creative invention requires the ability to have an undisciplined mind that is open to
Yes.
new possibilities,
Yeah.
and a disciplined mind that is able to select then between those and find what is truly
Yes.
useful and to figure out how it can be applied, you know.
I think to me great poets can really do that well. You know, they're all over the place with, you know, the notions of beauty, you know, that they're putting in all kinds of aspects
Right.
of their life, and, you know, how they perceive the world and the universe. And yet the wordsmithing,
Yeah.
to have just the right word, to convey just the right image, and have that structure, that vessel, that container, that just, where it spills out, but in a way that, you know, contains it so well so that we all can partake of it. It's extraordinary. Yeah.
Well, okay, that brings me back to another Hemingway thing, and this is more of a paraphrase, but he said something like, write about complicated things and understand the how complicated it is, and then state it simply.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So that it's deceptively simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess to tie in what's already been talked about is that the mind of the imagination is sort of, at least in this consensual society, it can be dangerous, right?
Yeah.
John Forbes Nash, who was the subject of A Beautiful Mind, the real John Forbes Nash often said that he needed to let his imagination go in order for him to visualize his numbers and how they interrelated with each
Yeah.
other. But the problem is that he would go beyond that into areas that we say is not real.
Right.
That's just a comment.
Right, and yeah, and I could go on, and I'm a clinical psychologist, by the way, who's definitely sort of a rebel in my field in many ways. When I say, by whose definition is, you know, are we defining, you know, in that respect, what's normal, what's real, and all of that. I think some of his suffering is the fact that there's not a container for him fully,
Yeah, I agree.
you know, only in terms of what's convenient for us,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, when all's said and done, so. But yeah, you know, you remind me too, I'm stumbling over the name, but the discovery of the chemical structure of the benzene ring came from somebody who was contemplating, racking his brain, could not understand the mysterious behavior of these molecules, how they would line up, and then had this dream of these beautiful circles, and realized, in fact, that the structure was a sort of donut-like ring. Thank you very much. Yeah, and so dependent on the dream itself, you know, was incubating that, and the pattern recognition from the dream led to this valuable discovery. Ultimately, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote the whole story of Jekyll and Hyde after feverishly having nightmares about it all night long. Wrote it almost in one sitting, you know, so that story is the product of his own nightmare about that. Yeah.
And I have another question.
Yeah.
David said earlier that he regarded shamanism as in some aspect an I'm not sure exactly what you said, David, so correct me if I'm wrong, but a part of it was schizophrenia.
Yeah, kin to schizophrenia.
Kin to schizophrenia. Could it be that in other societies, as you alluded to, where sort of aberrant behavior was more tolerated, that
Oh my gosh.
the shamans were in fact schizophrenic?
I could go on and on,
by our standards?
even to this day, and like North Korea is an example where those who are called to the shamanic path are those who are experiencing a peculiar kind of what we would call bipolar disorder and suicidal behavior and self-mutilation and cutting, who'd end up in a hospital medicated to the eyeballs. And in fact, when the signs are recognized, they're sent to the healer and the shaman to sort of train an apprentice. And when they are successful in their initiation, if they are, all of those symptoms kind of resolve. I could say
That's
so
in
much
North
more.
Korea?
Yeah, there's a certain form of Korean shamanism. The shamanism, it's misapplied as a term. It's whatever they call the healing practice in that particular area. That there was a whole National Geographic series called Taboo, where there was an interesting segment about this.
That seems pretty contrary to everything I've ever heard about the North Korean government there. I mean, all I've ever heard is how much they despise any kind of variation,
Well, yeah, I mean, this doesn't have anything really to do with government. It's
Yeah.
how people live and practice and work and all of that stuff. But
Aromatherapy is covered by Castro's Cuban,
yeah,
by the Castro healthcare system. So I mean,
yeah,
don't believe there's more under there than you might think.
yeah. But yeah, there's a place for understanding at least some forms of what we call mental illness is very deeply connected to a call to, an invitation to connect with this and to work healing. Julian, you had your hand up.
Yeah, you mentioned the benzene ring, and I've heard the story before, and I've noticed within my own personal life in terms of exploring a lot of altered states.
Yeah.
One of the things I used to do is I'm in IT, and I do a lot of programming. There's a lot of problem solving that I need to do, and I love brain entrainment technology.
Yeah.
And I would listen to different brain entrainment technology that would put me in a flow state while I was working.
Yeah.
I was amazed at, I would hit a problem,
Yeah.
and I'd just be in flow, and all of a sudden it's like, try this. And it made no logical sense to me whatsoever, and I would try that thing, and it would be the answer.
Yeah.
And the thing that I find is interesting in daydreaming,
Yeah.
we don't have, going to sleep and learning how to explore our dreams, learning our inner landscapes, I believe, is really, really important. Yet, we go into, we have moments of hypnagogic or moments of reverie throughout the day.
Yeah.
It's learning to tap into those or becoming conscious of them
Yeah.
so that we can be more deliberate about using them. And some of us would call those entering magical states prior to going into ritual.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I love what one of you said too, connecting up with that about how dangerous it is to do that ultimately, because you'll get these labels slapped on you, crazy, psychotic, If we engage the imagination in this kind of a way, it seems crazy and psychotic. So, I'm not surprised to hear a link, in the minds of some between someone who practices some form of shamanic journeying or shamanic practice as being psychotic, because if you're engaging imagination in this kind of an active way, you're going way outside the bounds of, what normal living and working is all about, and you're transcending that boundary.
Oh, no, that's all right. This might be actually, I'm not sure if this is a question for you or for Marcus later, but I'll just ask it and one of you can answer. The story you had about the rings, and I've heard similar stories about the discovery of the double helix as the DNA pattern. I'm trying to go in with our theme of the bridge between mysticism and science.
Yeah.
Do you feel, or maybe you can weigh in on this, that these flashes of insight, these inspirational moments of seeing a pattern where no pattern was recognized before, do you think those are an essential component of scientific discovery or just happy accidents?
Yes. Yeah, I think they are happy accidents and we need them for these sort of quantum leap advances, you know. I think that what we call scientific revolutions happen because someone will have these sort of intuitive leaps and then there's some systematic quantitative work done to kind of catch up to it, you know, and sort of document it and support it. I think that that happens fairly commonly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, that's why you define a leap of faith.
Yeah.
Is it a happy accident or is it not? What's your true
Yeah.
belief?
And I, you know, and it's possible to debate what sort of reasoning is happening at a super quick kind of level. Is this holistic intuitive leap really so out of the bounds of something that would be logical, or is it, you know, the exercise of some sort of super logic that happens to be integrative rather than linear? I mean, I think there's different ways to talk about that. Yeah.
Even using your Dreamgate concept and the idea of portals, I'm going to really go off out on a limb and say that I believe that there are times when these scientists and other people, artists and people, find a way through the portal, because I believe there are these portals that we can access. And yeah, it's madness and schizophrenia and a lot of other things too to go through these portals. And they're connecting into the group overmind, and they're getting knowledge that's out there,
Yeah.
and they're bringing it back in. And it's not their knowledge, it's everybody's knowledge, but they're
Yeah.
the ones that are facilitating it and bringing it to us. Whether it's a double helix or whatever it is, that's where they're getting it from.
Yeah. Excellent. What'd you say, Ange?
I was just saying it's an extraction.
Oh, yeah. Extracting from it, right?
Collective unconscious.
Yeah, I mean, what Jung called the collective unconscious is sort of the idea that archetypally we sort of stumble into the same sort of thematic kinds of things, like, you know, paintings and stories where there are tricksters and themes even can be archetypes. The themes of the weak overcoming the stronger through some sort of mischief or some sort of, you know, sleight of hand or whatever. We have the archetypes of the crones, you know, who are prominent. We have the wizards. We have so many. The idea is that we do because at some level there is this deep unconscious kind of connection that dates all the way back to our origin. And, you know, Jung sort of waffled admittedly about saying whether it's shared in our DNA and there's some sort of DNA structure to all of that, or if it's some sort of like connection through psyche that we have yet to kind of explain. It seemed like later in life he was much more unapologetically mystical than he was at the beginning. When as a young man, he wanted to establish himself as the hardcore scientist and the doctor and the one who had psychological reductive explanations for even the most way out kinds of things. As he aged, he stopped caring about that and he started being more honest about the fact that as a kid he was dragged to seances and that his mother was a channeler and that he himself seemed to channel some spirits at different times when, you know, during his boyhood. He sort of came more clean about those things a lot later, but I think early on he was more about his reputation. So I think he had a much more mystical sounding explanation for the collective unconscious than he did early on, but maintained that belief that there's this well that we all dip from through active imagination, and we share a connection with these thematic kinds of patterns that
That's why
sort of
the
emerge.
mandalas were so important,
Yeah.
because they kind of got you into the art and then into the